Among all the figures involved in the Indochina Wars, few have been studied and discussed more than Ngô Đình Diệm. After all, being the last Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam and the first President of the Republic of Vietnam, better known as South Vietnam, Diem and his impact on Vietnamese society cannot be ignored if one wants to truly understand one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. In fact, one could theoretically make the argument that he was, besides Ho Chi Minh of course, the most influential Vietnamese figure of the time period. Unfortunately, given that there has been so much discussion about the man, there have been a variety of myths that have been spread about Diem, three of which will be the subject of this video. I will label the three myths with the following titles: the puppet myth, the supremacist myth, and the savior myth. The puppet myth is that before 1954, Diem was a nobody who lacked any nationalist credentials. He only became famous after the Americans handpicked him to be their puppet. The supremacist myth is that Diem was a Catholic supremacist who hated Buddhists and wanted to eradicate Buddhism from Vietnam. And lastly, the savior myth is that had the United States not overthrown Diem, he would have ensured the survival of a free, non communist Vietnam. So, the first myth would be that before 1954, Diem was a nobody who lacked any nationalist credentials. He only became famous after the Americans handpicked him to be their puppet. Now, there is a bit of truth to this statement in that American aid was essential to the establishment and the survival of the Republic of Vietnam. Without American weapons and equipment, it is extremely unlikely that the ARVN would have been able to resist the communists in the early days of the war. Therefore, Diem did rely on the Americans for at least part of his success. That being said, one could say the same thing about the Viet Minh relying on Chinese support during the First Indochina War, or the Patriot rebels relying on French aid during the American Revolutionary War, for instance, with both of these groups sourcing most of their firepower from their respective benefactors. And yet, no one would call any of these two groups puppets of the entities that supported them. And as for Diem himself, he had a long history of nationalist sentiment that made him arguably the second most well known Vietnamese nationalist by 1950 or so. For instance, as a young mandarin in the imperial government, he resigned from the colonial administration in July 1933 in protest of French intrusions on Vietnamese sovereignty and the removal of Nguyen Hữu Bai, a former collaborator turned anti French nationalist mandarin. Diem persisted in his opposition to the French as a private citizen after his removal, and he was even watched by the French colonial police for his activities. Moreover, he was even friends with Phang Boi Chao, who was celebrated by both communists and anti-communists as, as one of the leading figures in the struggle for Vietnamese independence from the French colonial empire. Such an association further improved his image among the Vietnamese people. In case any of you were wondering what kind of nationalist he was, he subscribed to personalism, which was a Catholic based philosophy established by Emmanuel Mounier that sought to be a spiritual alternative to the materialist ideologies of Marxism and liberal capitalism. He adapted personalism to the environment of 20th century Vietnam, and his brand of Vietnamese nationalism was just one example of the many forms of Vietnamese nationalism that were distinct from Ho Chi Minh thought, as discussed in Dong Ngo An's book, which is linked in the description below. And now that we have just mentioned Ho Chi Minh, it is worth noting that he himself invited Diem to serve as Minister of the Interior on his cabinet for the new Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1946. Diem rejected his offer, claiming that he could not forgive the death of his older brother, Ngo Dinh Coi, at the hands of the Viet Minh in the immediate chaos following the August Revolution in 1945. Ho Chi Minh let him go out of respect, as the account of the conversation shows. It should be noted that while Diem failed to mention it in his own account of the meeting, he would have accepted the offer had Ho Chi Minh given him control over internal security policy as well. But regardless, the fact that Diem was invited to serve on the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's cabinet shows that even his future great rival appreciated his nationalist credentials and appeal among the Vietnamese people. Now that we have discussed his record of Vietnamese nationalism, we can now discuss how Bao Dai chose him to lead an anti-communist Vietnamese government in the first place. After failing to establish a third force that would serve as an anti-communist nationalist alternative to both the Viet Minh and the French in 1949, Diem had no choice but to leave Vietnam and remain overseas due to persecution from both the aforementioned two groups from 1949 to 1953. His experience serves as an interesting parallel to Ho Chi Minh's own experience overseas from 1911 to 1941, and yet many criticize Yim for supposedly being idle and cowardly for this decision to stay overseas, while these critics do not do the same for Ho Chi Minh. The fact of the matter is that both figures here slowly gained and built up support for their brand of nationalism. And in the case of Yim, with the assistance of his brothers, he eventually returned to the state of Vietnam, led by Emperor Bao Dai, which was a client state that had been established in 1949 by the French in order to win over anti communist nationalists. However, the lack of progress towards real Vietnamese autonomy had reduced the popularity of this arrangement. In this environment, he utilized his prestige and political abilities to build a viable coalition of anti-communist nationalists that was able to successfully pressure Bao Dai to appoint Yim as prime minister. This decision was made to the extreme chagrin of the French colonizers, who despised Yim's anti-colonial record and sentiment, and there is no evidence based on Vietnamese sources that Bao Dai was pressured to make this decision by the United States. Indeed, it is not as if the US government had even fully endorsed Yoon by this point in 1954, as only a handful of politicians like Senator John F. Kennedy, for instance, had supported him. Hence, it cannot really be said that there was a general intent and drive by the US government to have Yoon be selected as Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam. Of course, one often hears the argument that once he became president of South Vietnam, Diem was at that point fully entrenched as a puppet of the United States. Now, the definition of a puppet ruler is someone who fully obeys and listens to the will of a larger separate power. Let us examine a handful of his actions that make him a poor fit for this definition, to say the least. 1. The US government wanted the new South Vietnamese constitution, after the transition of the state of Vietnam to the Republic of Vietnam, to be modeled on the US and Philippine constitutions, with a firm separation of powers and limits on restricting individual liberties. Instead, Diem and his allies ratified a document that granted much more power to the executive. 2. The US government, through the Michigan State University Group, wanted the regional division of power within the Republic of Vietnam to be based on larger areas that were strongly tied to the central government, thereby replacing the traditional system of provinces. The proposed system was strongly inspired by the system of federalism within the United States that divides authority between the states and the federal government. Instead, Yin decided to preserve the provincial system, arguing that choosing morally upright individuals would ensure a lack of corruption within the system, and that centralizing the system of administration would undermine the local democratic tradition within the Vietnamese countryside that had developed and ensured mutual responsibility and virtue in a Confucian sense. 3. After JFK took office, MAG-JV and the Pentagon wanted Diem to reveal the inner workings of the Kang Lao Party or disband the organization entirely. Diem refused. 4. The United States and the Soviet Union concluded a neutralization agreement regarding Laos in 1962, and they wanted Diem to maintain diplomatic relations with Vientiane. Instead, being emboldened by the successes of the year, Diem broke off relations in October 1962 and prepared to launch a military offensive against communist forces in Laos. All of these examples can be found in the historian Edward Miller's book, Misalliance, and they, along with other examples, show that Yim, by the very definition of the word, could not have been a puppet of the United States government. So the second myth was that Ngô Đình Diệm was a Catholic supremacist who hated Buddhists and wanted to eradicate Buddhism from Vietnam. Now, the truth is that Yim did perceive Catholics as being more anti communist, meaning that he generally trusted them more than non Catholics. And he also tolerated the discrimination against non Catholics that was present at the lower levels of the South Vietnamese bureaucracy, with some Buddhists reporting pressure to convert to Catholicism in order to advance or be promoted. However, many Buddhists had acknowledged that at a personal level, he was not bigoted against Buddhists or other non Catholics. And his government directly funded Buddhist groups and the construction of many Buddhist temples, including Sala, a pagoda, leading up to 1960. And if you look at the government itself, most of his cabinet members and generals were non Catholic. And I would like to note that the reason I say non Catholic instead of Buddhist here is that it is also a myth that Vietnam was and is a Buddhist majority country. Buddhism is distinct from Vietnamese folk religion, which is the far more common belief system. And while it certainly takes elements from Buddhism, the two are not really equivalent. And if you look at the number of practicing Buddhists, it is a lot smaller than the reported, 80% or 90% that some Western scholars like to say. Now, what about the Buddhist crisis? The initial escalation of tensions that culminated in the crisis was really caused by his brothers, Ngô Đình Thục and Ngô Đình Nhu, along with the wife of the latter, Madame Nhu. And this makes sense because leading up to 1960, the relations between the Ngô family regime and the Buddhist activists was pretty friendly, actually. However, for Cope, he started antagonizing the Buddhists after he became Archbishop of Hue in 1960. And keep in mind that central Vietnam was the heartland of Vietnamese Buddhism, and his decision to start rapidly expanding churches in the area and pressuring local Buddhists and other non Catholics to convert did not win the South Vietnamese government any favors in this area. As for the latter two, the new couple repeatedly insulted the Buddhists as communist traitors who were just trying to subvert the government, when a decent chunk of them were just as anti communist as Diem was. Indeed, the Vietnamese communists themselves criticized the movement itself as reactionary and in opposition to Marxism and Leninism, albeit useful for destabilizing the Southern regime. And his family members continued to act recklessly in 1963. Indeed, the reason that Yim ordered the religious flan bag in the first place, that happened in 1963, was in response to one of Hope's Catholic rallies. The ban backfired because even though it was intended to be a general law against both Catholics and Buddhists, it was after a Catholic rally and before the Buddhist rallies on Vesak Day, so Buddhists were understandably upset. And the most famous self-immolation of all time, the one performed by Dick Guangduk, only happened because Madame Yu had derailed negotiations between Yim and the Buddhist activists that would have stabilized the situation by basically, repeating those criticisms of calling them traitors who were trying to subvert the South Vietnamese government. I still must note that Yim must be criticized here for not reining in his family and for perceiving the frustrated Buddhists as communist traitors himself, which led to his approval of the pagoda raids of August 21st, 1963. Of course, it is also worth mentioning that there have been Buddhist self immolations in post reunification Vietnam, with one example being the self immolation of Thich Hoa Thao on May 28, 1994. These acts were in protest of the current government due to its control and regulation over religious organizations, with Hoa Thao's brother claiming that Hoa Thao could no longer tolerate the Politburo's intrusive control over the Buddhist Church of Vietnam. And yet, very few of Yim's critics would view the Socialist Republic of Vietnam as even being oppressive towards Buddhists. Lastly, the third myth I'll be discussing today is that had the United States not overthrown Yim, he would have ensured the survival of a free, non communist Vietnam. Now, I must concede that it is true the overthrow of Yim significantly destabilized the South Vietnamese government, as indicated by American sources and Vietnamese sources as well. For instance, Ho Chi Minh himself said that he could, quote, scarcely believe that the Americans would be so stupid. And the North Vietnamese Politburo itself noted that Yim was one of the strongest individuals resisting the people and communism, and that among the anti-communists in South Vietnam or exiled in other countries, no one like Yim had the sufficient political assets and abilities to cause the others to obey. Lê Yong himself used the opportunity to escalate the war in response to the overthrow, leading to the general offensive by the communists in 1964 to 1965, which itself led Washington making the momentous decision to send American regular troops into South Vietnamese soil. These views and actions were because that Yim had stabilized the situation with his brutal counterinsurgency policies like the Strategic Hamlet Program, for example, to the chagrin of communist insurgents who noted they no longer had sufficient access to the people. In fact, a communist operative named Ha Mun-ri was so desperate to respond to his counterinsurgency policies that in 1957 he attempted to assassinate Yim while the president was giving a speech in Bang Met Hoc in the middle of his Central Highlands tour. And while this act would later be celebrated by the reunified Vietnamese government, it must be mentioned that his attempt was not ordered by the North Vietnamese Politburo, showing the complexity in the relationship between Hanoi and communist operatives in the South. My response to this claim, the overall claim, is that first, the coup was one supported by the Americans, not one that was entirely planned and organized by the Americans. Therefore, the long term prospects of the Republic of Vietnam were mostly out of the control of the United States, given the political constraints at the time, of course. And while the situation was stable and certainly better for the state's survival than the next 2 years would have been, there's no guarantee that under Diem, South Vietnam would have ended up like South Korea, for instance, which is the country that many nostalgic for the South Vietnamese government like to compare it to. Indeed, South Korea and South Vietnam were in completely different environments and in completely different circumstances, so a comparison in this manner cannot really be made. The fact that the following years were so contingent on the fall of the Ngô regime also makes it very difficult to predict whether or not his regime would have preserved an independent and non communist Vietnamese state, given that there are so many factors that come into play and so many different things that could change. And my final point on this matter is somewhat connected to the first point in this subsection, but it is that there had already been coups against him. For instance, in 1960, there was the paratroopers coup, led by the colonels Vương Quang Dam and Nguyen Chan Thê, and it was nearly successful in overthrowing the regime. And two Republic of Vietnam Air Force pilots even bombed the Independence Palace in 1962, with these pilots expressing frustration that Yim was more focused on gaining power for himself and his family than on fighting the communists. Hence, the truth is that while his overthrow did rapidly deteriorate the prospects of South Vietnam's survival, that does not imply that the situation before the coup d'etat was perfect, and one ought to be more agnostic or uncertain about whether or not Yim would have certainly preserved a non communist independent Vietnamese state. That's the end of the video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'm open to hearing feedback. Have a great day.